The malleability of the self, the irreducible principle of psychological vulnerability. The most foundational truth unifying this collection is the recognition that the human psyche is not a static, self-contained entity, but a dynamic, open system, inherently susceptible to influence and reconfiguration. This principle, which we define as the malleability of the self, forms the necessary precondition for all concepts of persuasion, manipulation, brainwashing, and even psychological healing described across the texts. Without this intrinsic vulnerability, the strategies detailed by Green, Reyes, Cialdini, and Sargent would be inert. The architecture of this vulnerability is mapped out by two distinct yet interconnected systems: the cognitive shortcut mechanism and the psychoanalytic foundation of need. The cognitive shortcut mechanism as a design flaw. The work of Robert B. Cialdini, Influence, provides a direct articulation of the cognitive shortcut mechanism, detailing 6 universal heuristics: reciprocity, commitment, and consistency, social proof, authority, liking, and scarcity, which are essentially adaptive shortcuts for efficient decision-making. These principles are designed to preserve cognitive energy in a complex world, but in the context of psychological leverage, they represent the mind's critical failure points. When a manipulator, as discussed by Reyes in Forbidden Psychology, leverages these principles, they are not creating a new psychological state. They are merely hijacking an existing, evolutionarily beneficial mechanism. For instance, the principle of commitment and consistency exploits the deep, almost existential, human need to align present action with past declarations. Once a small commitment is secured, the manipulator utilizes the mind's internal pressure, the automatic desire to maintain a coherent self-narrative, to extract larger, inconsistent concessions. Similarly, social proof bypasses rational deliberation by substituting the perceived consensus of a group for independent judgment, exploiting the adaptive, though often misplaced, trust in collective wisdom. In the dark application of these principles, the operator moves from ethical persuasion to what Reyes terms penetrating and bending vulnerable minds, by deliberately engineering environments of cognitive stress, ambiguity, or manufactured scarcity, thus forcing the target to rely exclusively on these shortcuts. The ethical ambiguity of influence is not in the principles themselves, but in the recognition that these fundamental pathways can be weaponized. The psychoanalytic foundation of need and the dissociative potential, deeper than the cognitive shortcuts, lies the psychoanalytic foundation of need, a system elaborated upon by Sigmund Freud, General Psychological Theory. Freud's exploration of the libido, narcissism, and repression provides the underlying theoretical substrate that explains why the shortcuts work and how extreme influence, brainwashing, is possible. The malleability of the self, in the Freudian sense, is rooted in the constant, often unconscious negotiation between the primal demands of the id, the moral constraints of the superego, and the reality-testing function of the ego. When the ego's defense mechanisms fail, the self becomes critically malleable. For example, the techniques of brainwashing and political indoctrination analyzed by William Sargent, Battle for the Mind, which rely on induced states of exhaustion, anxiety, confession, and intense pressure, can be seen as a direct, empirical assault on the ego's ability to process reality. Sargent's work details how extreme physiological stress can temporarily dismantle the brain's ability to sustain complex, resistant belief structures, leading to a state where new, contradictory information is readily absorbed. This is the moment where the self bifurcates, a concept critically examined by Robert W. Reber, the bifurcation of the self. Reber's historical and critical analysis of dissociation reveals that the mind's ultimate defense against overwhelming, unmanageable reality, whether the trauma of an unethical experiment, dark science experiments, or the continuous assault of brainwashing, is to partition its own consciousness. The dissociative break is the definitive proof of the mind's non-unitary, non-static nature. It is the physical manifestation of the self's malleability under extreme duress. The manipulative strategies detailed by Green, particularly in The Art of Seduction, often aim to induce a lesser controlled form of this partitioning by isolating the target, creating emotional highs and lows, and manufacturing a crisis of self-regard. By forcing the target to question their established reality, the seducer creates a gap where a new self-image, dependent on the operator, can be implanted. In synthesis, the malleability of the self is an inherent condition of human existence. A system of shortcuts designed for efficiency, Cialdini, that are susceptible to hijacking, Reyes, Green, which itself is undergirded by a deep negotiated structure of primal needs and defenses, Freud, that, under sufficient stress, Sargent, Piplani, can fragment into autonomous components, Reber. The first principle is thus, the self is a battlefield whose boundaries are maintained by cognitive and psychic energy. When that energy is depleted or strategically redirected, the self yields. This insight is the launching point for all forms of intentional influence. The calculus of social power, the amoral transaction of interpersonal leverage. The second core principle that emerges from the synthesis of these texts is that power is a descriptive calculus, an objective social physics predicated on the control of resources, perception, and human wants, and is fundamentally amoral in its execution. This principle, which we term the calculus of social power, moves beyond the internal vulnerability of the self to examine the external systemic dynamics that govern all interpersonal and institutional relationships. The works of Robert Greene, The 48 Laws of Power and the Art of Seduction, and the analyses of the manipulative personality, In Sheep's Clothing and the Psychopath Whisperer, collectively define this calculus as an ever-present, transactional, reality power as performance and perception. Greene's philosophy, particularly in the 48 Laws of Power, functions as a grammar of this calculus. The laws are not moral prescriptions but distilled observations of historical and human behavior, principles that operate irrespective of the practitioner's virtue. The core of this calculus is the assertion that perception is the ultimate resource. Laws such as always say less than necessary, conceal your intentions, and get others to do the work for you all pivot on the meticulous management of one's external presentation. This reframes power not as an innate quality, but as a deliberate performance, a theatrical mechanism designed to instill awe, unpredictability, or confidence in the observer. In this light, the calculus of social power dictates that leverage is not gained by being intrinsically superior, but by being perceived as superior, indispensable, or unknowable. The manipulative tactics detailed by Blake Reyes align with this, suggesting that techniques like neuro-linguistic programming, NLP, are merely sophisticated tools for optimizing the performance of power, specifically by aligning one's verbal and nonverbal communication, body language, to bypass the target's rational defenses and appeal directly to the emotional perceptual brain. The focus shifts entirely from ethical engagement to instrumental effectiveness. The instrumental mindset and the structure of manipulative intent. The most profound and often most dangerous realization of the calculus of social power is its manifestation in the instrumental mindset, epitomized by the profiles of psychopathy and manipulative personalities described by George K. Simon, In Sheep's Clothing, and Kent Keel, The Psychopath Whisperer. The psychopath, as scientifically analyzed by Keel, represents the pure player of the calculus, a mind structurally and functionally deficient in the emotional architecture necessary for empathy, the lack of conscience, making every social interaction a purely instrumental transaction. Simon's work on manipulative personalities reveals the behavioral architecture that arises from this instrumental core. The manipulator employs cognitive distortion techniques, such as denial, projection, passive aggression, and selective inattention, not merely to achieve an end, but to systematically control the reality of the victim. This is a direct application of the calculus. By distorting the victim's perception of responsibility and intent, the manipulator secures the necessary resource, guilt, debt, compliance, with zero cost to their own self-image or moral ledger. The first principle of the calculus is that a relationship is a system of inputs and outputs. The manipulative mind seeks to maximize output, gain, while minimizing input, effort, responsibility, vulnerability. The synthesis of Green's and Simon's work reveals a critical paradox. The laws of power, while amoral, are entirely dependent on the moral and emotional framework of the majority. The manipulative person succeeds precisely because most people operate with assumptions of reciprocity, good faith, and shared humanity, the very principles Cialdini identifies. The psychopath is the ultimate embodiment of the calculus because they are unconstrained by the social contract, viewing moral restraint as a weakness to be exploited. In summary, the calculus of social power is the objective law of the social jungle. Leverage is the currency, perception is the multiplier, and emotional moral restraint is the liability. It is a system built on manufactured desire, seduction, controlled presentation, power, and the ruthless pursuit of self-interest, manipulation, psychopathy. It asserts that in the absence of a strong internal ethical counter-framework, the social world defaults to a zero-sum game of dominance and submission, where human relationships are merely levers for the attainment of a desired outcome. The shadow of scientific hubris, the inevitable confrontation with ethical boundaries. The final synthesized principle arises from the dark historical and theoretical undercurrents of the collection. The relentless pursuit of knowledge about, and thus control over, the malleable self invariably leads to a confrontation with, and often the catastrophic violation of, fundamental ethical and humanitarian boundaries. This principle, the shadow of scientific hubris, is the philosophical reckoning required once the first two principles, vulnerability and power calculus, are acknowledged. It represents the point where descriptive analysis shifts to prescriptive action, often with devastating human consequences. The history of forbidden knowledge and the objectification of the self, the books focusing on unethical experiments, Dark, Science Experiments by Piplani, and the physiological study of control, Battle for the Mind, serve as a historical warning that the desire to understand the malleable self is inseparable from the impulse to control it. Piplani's examination of programs like MKUltra and the Stanford Prison Experiment are empirical evidence of the dangers inherent in treating the human mind not as a subject of inherent dignity, but as a system, an object to be tested, broken, and re-engineered for instrumental purposes, military, political, or academic. The central violation of the shadow of scientific hubris is the objectification of the self. Once the self is reduced to a set of variables, vulnerabilities, and predictable responses, as detailed by the manipulative tactics, the scientific or political operative finds justification for overriding consent and inflicting harm. Sargent's work, which analyzes the physiological basis of conversion and brainwashing, inadvertently lays out the scientific manual for this hubris by describing the physical processes of psychological breakdown. When a mechanism for control is identified, the ethical restraint against utilizing it must be conscious and external. The science itself is amoral, as established in the second principle, the ethical reckoning and the necessity of external constraints. Very existence of texts like Ethical Issues in Psychology. A critical introduction underscores the necessity of drawing a firm line against the inherent dangers of the calculus of social power when wielded by institutions or researchers. Banyard and Flanagan's critical analysis of experiments that crossed boundaries, serving as the counter-narrative to the amoral history, demonstrates that ethics are not an optional overlay, but the essential, hard-won framework required to prevent the malleability of the self from becoming a tool of state-sanctioned cruelty. The ethical crisis emerges when the researcher's ambition, a form of power derived from knowledge, overrides the subject's autonomy, the dignity of the self. The rules of informed consent, non-maleficence and beneficence were created precisely to counteract the pathologies described in the other texts. The temptation of authority, Cialdini's principle, to compel obedience, and the belief that AI, superior intelligence, Green's philosophy applied to science, is entitled to manipulate lesser minds. Even the study of dark personalities, as conducted by Keel, the psychopath whisperer, confronts this ethical shadow. While Keel's work is descriptive and focused on neurological correlation, the implicit ethical challenge is profound. If psychopathy is a predictable, biological configuration, a lack of conscience, what are the ethical implications for individual responsibility, treatment, and societal constraint? The knowledge gained brings great insight into the structure of manipulative intent, but simultaneously increases the theoretical possibility of predicting and potentially controlling those traits, reopening the door to the very forms of objectification the ethical texts seek to forbid. The Freudian and dissociative link to societal trauma. Finally, Freud's controversial metapsychology, especially regarding repression and the primal nature of the psyche, connects the shadow of scientific hubris to collective societal trauma. The experiments detailed in Dark Science Experiments are not isolated acts of madness. They are institutionalized manifestations of a repressed, collective desire for total control. The trauma induced by unethical research and mind control, Piplani, Sargent, often results in the extreme fragmentation of the self. Reber's dissociation, proving that the abuse of power leaves a lasting structural alteration on the individual. Psyche. The ultimate lesson of this principle is that the pursuit of psychological power, whether through the manipulation of an individual or the control of a population, is a self-fulfilling prophecy of ethical failure. Once the inherent vulnerability of the mind, Principle 1, is coupled with the pursuit of instrumental gain, Principle 2, the trajectory toward moral violation is almost inevitable, demanding the rigid external constraint of ethical law. The shadow of scientific hubris is the recognition that the power to control the mind is fundamentally more dangerous than the power to control the physical body, as the former destroys the internal reality upon which all dignity is founded.